Well, hello. This is the Gaza War Sit Rep day 146. No end in sight. I've got a bunch of things to do today. I want to talk about the different fronts. There was a speech by the leader of the Houthis, Ansarallah, but his name is Houthi, Abdul Malik al-Houthi. An interesting speech. And the military news, and I want to talk a lot more about Rwanda. There's been parallels made with the Rwandan genocide of 1994, and I know a lot about that, and I'll tell you why. You can investigate how much I know about it and decide for yourself if you like. But I, and I want to explain why the parallels. Every genocide has things in common, but there are also reasons why it doesn't fit, and the uniqueness of different situations, and the uniqueness of this situation and the Rwanda situation. So I will get into that, Rwanda and Congo, because people are talking about what's going on in Congo right now, and I'll give you the background on what's going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo right now as well, because there's no way to separate what is happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo from what happened in Rwanda in 1994, and I will explain why that is tonight as well. But first, let's get to some news from the fronts. The Battle of Zaytoun continues. The Battle of Zaytoun is Zaytoun, as you may know, probably if you've been following these sit reps. The Zaytoun is a neighborhood in Gaza City in the north, and the resistance there, led by Hamas's armed wing Qassam, reports today detonating two booby-trapped tunnels, resulting in casualties, a pre-rigged building targeting an Israeli infantry force south of Zaytoun, targeting 3 armored personnel carriers and a Merkava tank with Yasin 105s and Shoaz explosive devices in al-Zaytoun neighborhood, and anti-personnel mine. There's video of some of these things. The explosions are big, and what I gather from the web is that these are explosives, unexploded ordnance that was dropped on Gaza by the Israelis that is then being repurposed to build these bombs. And John Elmer, Jon Elmer, who was on yesterday's sit rep, explained that those bombs in yesterday's Electronic Intifada live stream. So day 145 live stream, check that out. Al-Quds brigades is fighting in Khan Yunis. The Mujahideen brigades are fighting, Nasser Salahuddin brigades are fighting in Khan Yunis and in Gaza City in Zaytoun. And Hezbollah also, people asked about what's going on with Hezbollah. The Hezbollah front is by no means stopped or paused. Israeli soldiers getting targeted on Jal al-Alam site, Cobra Hill, Ramtha, in Shaba Farms, Ailan settlement, spy and technical facilities in Ruwaysat al-Alam, the Horam settlement with rockets. So Hezbollah continues to fire. So today, as far as Ansarallah goes, it's a big day in terms of speeches. A big speech by Abdul Malik al-Houthi. So I'll just go through some of the main points of his speech. He says a lot of the things that, a lot of us are thinking. He says genocide is a terrible, horrific, and dangerous title that should not pass by our ears as something normal. The Israeli enemy has turned the gathering of hungry and besieged people at A's trucks into a trap, targeting them. That's referring to the Al-Rashid massacre, also being known as the Flower Massacre today. I'm sure you guys know all about that. I'm not going to elaborate on that. al-Malik al-Houthi said the number of martyrs, missing, wounded, and prisoners has reached 114,000, 1/10 of the population. All residents are living a real tragedy. All children are facing famine, and it has not. Israel has still not displaced the residents from the Strip. You've probably read about the Egypt potentially being willing to accept the residents of Gaza into the Sinai as part of in exchange for some debt relief. I mean, it could be. I've said before, I put nothing past them. I don't think it's a very feasible plan, and I also because it would. The Israelis don't want the part that nobody is saying is that the Israelis don't want the Palestinians displaced to the Sinai. They want the Palestinians displaced to the Sinai under Israeli control. They want forever control over the Palestinian population. Everybody talks about how Israel wants the land without the people. That's not true. They want control over every detail of Palestinian life. They are absolutely obsessed with Palestinians and controlling their lives and their deaths. And that is it's not going to change if they displace them to Sinai. And so this whole plan of displacing Palestinians to Sinai is basically a plan to for Egypt to hand over a big chunk of Egyptian territory to Israel. And maybe they're willing to do that, and then we'll see what happens next. That would not be the end of the war, because the Palestinians are fighting that. They're fighting Israeli control over every detail of their lives, and they're not going to stop until that's no longer the case. So maybe this will go on. Maybe the famine will take many, many more lives. Maybe Israel will keep bombing for a long time, but this war will continue while Palestinians are unfree. I had a thought about that too, just the West assigning Israel all these extraordinary rights. You can't give people extraordinary rights without taking rights away to an extraordinary extent from their victims, right? It's the exceptional right to commit genocide and lie and control how Israel is talked about throughout the West. Those rights are what the flip side of all of those rights that Israel and its supporters have is the super oppression, famine, and genocide and mass murder of Palestinians. And those inevitably go together. So as long as Israelis have these super rights and super privileges, Palestinians will experience this super oppression as well. Back to al-Houthi's speech. So he said, if people, and I think he means Jordan and Israel, provided support to the people of Gaza, the effectiveness would be doubled, and the Palestinian people could decisively resolve the battle against the enemy. But the Arab approach, again, I think he means Egypt, Jordan, Palestinian Authority, etc., to the Palestinian issue is regressive, reaching the extent of normalization with the enemy. Of course, because al-Houthi is from Yemen, he also was probably talking about and to the Gulf monarchies, Saudi Kingdom, etc. Arabs cannot shirk their responsibility. Doing so would have serious consequences for them in this world and the hereafter. This is not temporary events that end with a deal, compromise, or temporary calm. It is more profound. This is a struggle with its background and roots. And so he's kind of talking about how you can't just, he basically says this: each escalation phase is dealt with on its own, as if it's an isolated emergency, and you end your concern once it ends. Demolishing al-Aqsa and replacing it with their temple remains a primary goal for the Israelis, alongside occupying many Arab areas. And so he's trying to say, this is not like, there might be a ceasefire, but this conflict is deeper and it's going to continue. So do not, right. He notes that Biden and officials in Britain and Europe boast to others that they're Zionists. The allegiance of Western leaders and officials to Zionism means that they carry a very hostile vision against our nation and our peoples. It's strange to love your enemy who hates you, harbors hatred towards you, despises you, and violates everything about you. And this is clearly the Houthi are not followers of Gandhi or even, I guess, Christianity, because those ideas that you're supposed to love your enemy are not, they don't subscribe to that. He says, the steadfastness of the fighters in Gaza, there's a lesson. So he kind of lists lessons. He says, in the steadfastness of Hezbollah, since its inception, there's a great lesson and moral for all members of the nation. In the effectiveness, like the fighters of Iraq, there are important lessons. The effectiveness of Yemen are clear lessons for all Muslims. So he says no matter how many crimes they commit, the Zionists will not remain in control over Palestine or the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He lists the number of ships. They've targeted 54 ships. They've hit 384 missiles and drones. And he says, our stance is completely tied to what is happening in Gaza, and our stance from the beginning is clear regarding ships associated with Israel. If the enemy's operations have any effect, it'll be the opposite of what they intend. It'll contribute to the development of our military capabilities, and they have felt that. Did they imagine that by bombing the capital Sana'a, they'll make the families hide in their homes? They will not affect the morale of our people, not even among children. He kind of mocks you probably heard that a German ship shot at some American planes. He said the German warship fired a missile at an American plane and a commercial ship, which indicates failure, confusion, and anxiety. And he says it's necessary to allow food, medicine, and humanitarian needs to the people in Gaza and stop the crimes of genocide. He says to the Yemeni people, your turnout last Friday means a lot. Our military operations express the will of the people who turn out by the millions. When a person is given the opportunity to be in a great position and does not act, it is a serious situation for him. And he concludes, we will not tire, we will not slack, we will not weaken, and we will not retreat. To the Palestinian people and fighters, you are not alone. And our people, by turning out tomorrow, Friday, will practically turn out tomorrow. You are not alone. You have our support until victory. So that was Ansarallah's speech, a very important speech, I think, in terms of where the resistance is at. I think those are the fronts. I did want to this is not a military update per se, but I did want to call your attention to a story by a very good Canadian journalist, Brishti Basu, who's been covering what's going on in Canada in terms of this file. So the story's abuse of power, hospitals, med schools crack down on Palestine advocacy, immediate suspensions, harsh repercussions plague healthcare workers advocating for Palestine, a breach investigation has found. So it's on the breach. Brishti Basu was with CBC, covered this same stuff really well, and contract was not renewed because of budget cuts, purely coincidental, etc. So that, I think, is the news update. Now I'm going to talk about Rwanda and the Rwandan genocide. And this is an incredibly complex topic, and you could do dozens of sit reps just about it, following that war and that genocide from that time. And so condensing it tonight, I'll condense it tonight as much as I can, but maybe I'll revisit it. I'll share with you, if you want to read more about it, there is a book that I wrote about it. I wrote a book about this called America's Wars on Democracy in Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it should be here somewhere. I should be able to show it to you. But I'll just pull it up. Okay. Just share this screen with you, what it looks like. I didn't get to choose hardly anything about it. I didn't really choose the title. I didn't really choose the cover, but here it is. America's Wars on Democracy in Rwanda and the DR Congo. It's expensive to buy, but you'll find that it's available in the usual places where people look for books and so on. So I'm sure it's in your library. So in this book, I cover from independence all the way to the 2000s and the end of the second 1998 to 2003 Congo War. So how can we start? All right, I'll just try to give you a narrative of what happened leading up to the 1994 Rwandan genocide. Okay. The Congo, the Congo, as part of the scramble for Africa, the Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, they all become European colonies. Rwanda and Burundi have a kind of complicated colonial history. They were German for a little while. They were Belgian for a while. Belgium, like the other European colonies, had race theories of superior and inferior races that they imposed on the multi-ethnic African societies that they colonized. One of them was the idea of a race hierarchy in Rwanda and Burundi, where they identified the Tutsis as a superior race and the Hutus as a inferior race. And the Hutus, this was a categorization that existed. The ruling class of Rwanda and Burundi were traditionally Tutsi. It was almost like that was the name of the ruling class. So it wasn't a racial, of course, races don't exist. So it clearly wasn't a racial category until the Belgians imposed it. And they did similar things in Congo. There's a lot more. Congo's a much bigger country. Congo's a country right now of, I don't know, 60 plus million. It's probably even bigger. Let me look. Rwanda is a country of 11 or 12 million people. Let's see. DRC has 100 million. So 100 million in DR Congo. And let's see, Rwanda. Rwanda, I bet, is around 15 million, maybe. At the time in the 90s, it was around 9 million. It's 13 million-ish now. So you can imagine DRC is 100 million, Rwanda is 13 million, and it's always been like that. That ratio has always been like 10 times. Congo is 10 times bigger, but they're neighbors. Maybe I can pull up a map and show you. Yeah, I can show you a map. Okay. Here's a map of the gigantic Democratic Republic of Congo. These are the two eastern provinces of the Democratic Republic of Congo, known as the Kivus. This is where most of the violence not all, but most of the violence, most of the deaths, most of the mass rapes in Congo have taken place since the 1990s. And Rwanda and Burundi, roughly similar in size to these two relatively small but densely populated provinces of Congo. Rwanda is here, Burundi is here. So they're all part of this region. You can see Uganda here, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe's down here, Angola, Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Sudan. So Congo is right in the middle of Africa, surrounded by all of these neighbors. and Belgium was allowed to take it in the scramble for Africa by Britain because they wanted to make sure that Portuguese colonies couldn't connect and German colonies couldn't connect to each other. So Britain had this idea, because Britain ruled the seas, they didn't need the land connections the way that their colonial rivals may have been interested in having them. So they liked the idea of Belgium having one huge colony right in the middle, breaking up the contiguity for their colonial rivals. I covered all this in the Scramble for Africa podcast that I did, historical podcast that we did a couple of years back. So if you want, hours and hours and hours of background on the Scramble for Africa, including a long episode on the Uganda proposal, the Zionist plan to establish Israel in here, around here, actually, Kenya, a little farther east. That's also covered in the Scramble for Africa series. Okay, so in Congo becomes a personal possession of King Leopold. You probably know about King Leopold's Ghost, the book by Adam Hochschild. Leopold kills like 2/3 of the people of Congo in this process over a short 15-year period. 10 million people are killed by Leopold. He cuts off their hands. There's all kinds of atrocity photographs. It's not that different from what the Germans and the French and the English are doing. Okay, it's important. Hochschild says this at the end of his book. All the colonial powers did this in Africa. It was part of their racism and their race supremacy. And this is what they did. They committed just these incredible, horrific atrocities in the Scramble for Africa and colonialism. They gave Belgium took over. They said, King Leopold is too abusive. So to save them from King Leopold, we're gonna make the Congo a colony of Belgium. So that didn't improve things at all. There was an independence struggle throughout the interwar period, the 30s, 40s, 50s, and after World War II, and after India became independent, and the kind of Algeria War, there was a sense that Africa was going to become independent, and Belgium was forced to give up the DRC. Rwanda, Burundi became independent as well. And in the process of leaving, the Belgians committed all kinds of destruction. The way that they do when they leave, they try to poison the country permanently. So they kind of sponsored the Hutus and encouraged them to kind of avenge themselves on the Tutsis. And in Rwanda, the Hutu, there was a thing called like a Hutu revolution. The Hutus were the majority. Like I said, Tutsi was kind of synonymous with the ruling class, not a racial category really, but more of a status category historically. So there was a Hutu revolution in Rwanda, and then there was a kind of a reaction in Burundi where the Tutsis maintained the kind of power in Burundi. So in both cases, the militaries were supported by the colonial powers for a long time. They set up what Kwame Nkrumah called neo-colonialism, and the most promising leader you also probably know about, Patrice Lumumba. The Belgians killed him with a lot of American help and a lot of United Nations complicity as well, all covered in my book, covered in other great sources too. The Assassination of Patrice Lumumba by Ludo de Witte, I think is his name, is a fantastic book on that assassination. So Lumumba is killed. They install a dictator. America really starts to take over neocolonialism in this part of the world. So America becomes the sponsor of Mobutu. Mobutu is the dictator of Congo. He renames it Zaire. And Mobutu is the kind of linchpin of the US control of Central Africa. I mean, that geographic position that I mentioned, it is as being so important is also what makes it so useful for the US to control, which is also why they assassinated Lumumba, to ensure that that key resource remained under their control. So they sponsored Mobutu, and Mobutu remained in power for 30 years. So we're into the 90s. There's a democratic movement in the Congo to get rid of Mobutu and have democratic elections. Is a long-running opposition. In fact, one of the leaders was named Etienne Tshisekedi, and the current prime minister of Congo, maybe the president of Congo, is Felix Tshisekedi. Let me check his title. I think it's president. Yeah, sorry, president since 2019. So so that's where we are. That's where we are in the story. In the it's the early 1990s. There's democratic movements. They want multi-party democracy, and there is also in Uganda. Let's put that map back up. Actually, in Uganda, there is a movement of exiles. You see Rwanda's here, Eastern Congo's here, Uganda's here. And there's a movement of exiles, one of whom is Paul Kagame, and he's a military leader trained by the United States at Fort Leavenworth. And Paul Kagame is the leader of a group of exiles who have a background fighting with still the leader of Uganda, who became leader in the 1980s in a series of very brutal wars called the Bush Wars that killed hundreds of thousands of people. Museveni and Kagame was one of his intelligence chiefs, actually. Paul Kagame was. Kagame was the leader of a group of exiles called the Rwandan Patriotic Front. So the Rwandan Patriotic Front in 1990 leaves Uganda with Ugandan military support and American military support, leaves Uganda, attacks northern Rwanda, and occupies a part of northern Rwanda. These are Tutsi. There was Tutsi and Hutu, but they were opposed to the so-called Hutu revolution of the 60s, and they wanted to undo that Hutu revolution of the 60s and restore the traditional power structure more like what they had in Burundi, where the old leadership of Tutsi leadership was going to be in place, and Paul Kagame himself was from that group. Now, to get there's considerable nuance, because Rwanda, North Rwanda, which is where Kagame invaded, and they occupied a part of North Rwanda around Ruhengeri, starting in 1990. And they occupied that part of Rwanda, and they said basically they wanted to take the whole country, but the Hutu revolution, the regime in Rwanda had a lot of French military aid. They were kind of part of France Afrique. If you've been watching what's been happening in Niger and West Africa, you've seen the French progressively getting kicked out of West Africa by independent-minded military regimes. In Central Africa, this process happened in the 1990s, and they were kicked out by American-friendly regimes, not independent regimes like they're kicking them out, like who's kicking the French out in West Africa. So here, what you have is you have Kagame and then Rwandan Patriotic Front based in Uganda, going back and forth to and from Rwanda, but occupying a part of northern Rwanda, unable to take the rest of the country because the Rwandan government is backed up by the French, and the Americans are backing Kagame, and they're backing Mobutu. And at some point, well, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So the Rwandan Patriotic Front and Kagame, they are occupying a part of Rwanda in the north where there is a very, very small Tutsi population. So Tutsis are maybe 10% of the population of Rwanda. And there's very, very few of them in the north. Most of them live in the south. Lots of them live in the capital. And so the north is, you have this kind of Tutsi led exile army that wants to take over Rwanda. And the part of Rwanda that they're occupying is one where there are almost no Tutsis to kind of support them. So they displace a couple of million people from North Rwanda. And these North Rwandan people, mostly Hutus, have been displaced, and they're told, they're going to be re-enslaved by the Kagame and Kagame's army. And Kagame's army committed massacres of these people to displace them, trying to put them in their place. But what ended up happening was they fled. So this was not like a liberated, they were trying to present it like it was a liberated zone, right? Like Mao Zedong in China, where they liberated the people from their oppressive regime. But in fact, they displaced the people, and it was like an empty, like emptied out ghost town, and from which millions of angry people were in camps in the south, kind of enraged that the government was unable to get them back to their land. And so in the south, where the Rwandan, they're called the interior Tutsi, where they were living, the Hutus started to attack them and kind of blame them for the Rwandan Patriotic Front, even though, some of them for sure supported the Rwandan Patriotic Front, but lots of them didn't, and they all were being attacked by refugees, by people who were displaced, and by people who were like being kind of stoked into a fear of the interior Tutsi being working for the Rwandan Patriotic Front. This is when there's a peace process, which is brokered by the United Nations as well as by the United States. And the United States, in all these peace processes, acts quite independently of the United Nations, and they were covertly backing Kagame the whole time. And then the United Nations comes in and basically says that the government, the regime, has to negotiate a power sharing arrangement with Kagame. And so they negotiate for years. The negotiations go on for years. There's like, maybe we'll have an election, but Kagame doesn't really want an election because Kagame wouldn't really win an election, especially not against the Hutu revolution kind of candidates. So they were trying to negotiate a power sharing. They negotiated a power sharing where like where most of the army would be taken over by the Rwandan Patriotic Front. And so these negotiations were going, and the Kagame's people were getting more and more at the negotiating table. They were getting almost everything, but there's always a concern that if the Rwandan government is in place, that if there's a democratic election, nobody will vote for Kagame. These are people who attacked from a different country. They were raised in a different country. They displaced millions of people. They committed massacres in the north, and now they want to rule Rwanda after having been gone since the 1960s. So they weren't Kagame wasn't gonna win an election. So in 1994, during this one of these rounds of negotiation, Kagame's Rwandan Patriotic Front assassinated the president of Rwanda. The president of Burundi was also on the plane that was shot down. The plane was shot down in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda. And at that point, the negotiations had actually included a column of Rwandan Patriotic Front troops being allowed to be headquartered in Kigali. So after the assassination, those troops in Kigali immediately attacked, and then there was a big wave of attack from the north. And they followed this kind of battle plan where they encircled the Rwandan government forces and defeated them. The French were basically prevented by the United Nations, who had a Canadian commander at the time. They were prevented from helping by, like, it was kind of negotiated that they weren't really going to help. They weren't allowed to help the Rwandan regime anymore. The Americans had basically swept France out of there. And that's the context where the Rwandan genocide happened. It was the Rwandan army, which was being progressively destroyed by the American-backed Rwandan Patriotic Front, and the kind of masses of displaced people from the north, as well as, you know, all kinds of chaos that happened when order broke down and when all the military forces were being destroyed. And then, though there were massacres of Tutsis and also massacres of Hutus by these militias. They murdered people at checkpoints. So there was a lot of like murder of people who were accused of supporting the RPF in the war. So it was happening at the same time as a war. It was happening as the Kagame's forces were conquering the country. It was happening as United Nations forces were preventing a French intervention to save the government or to separate the sides or to have a ceasefire, because they were basically arguing that any French intervention was going to save the government, the Rwandan government, which obviously Kagame didn't want. So over a 3-month period, there were killings of like 1,000 people a day or more. Several thousand people a day were being killed in these big massacres. And so by the end, it's like it was hundreds of thousands of people that were killed in these massacres over about 100 days. And the Rwandan Patriotic Front also committed huge massacres, at least tens of thousands, maybe closer to 100,000 or more, of Hutus in the areas where they conquered. And so it was a genocidal event. It was triggered by this assassination, this war of conquest that Kagame was fighting. And at the end, there was an intervention by France in the end, a kind of a unilateral intervention by France. And what they did was they basically stopped Kagame's forces from taking one corner of the country, and millions of people fled from that through that corridor into the Democratic Republic of Congo, into the Kivus. Remember the Kivus. So at the end of the war in 1994, what you have is you have a bunch of people, you have hundreds of thousands of people in camps inside Rwanda. You have millions of people in camps around the Kivus in Goma and Bukavu. And that's the situation. And then you have hundreds of thousands of people that were killed, mostly by militias taking advantage of a total breakdown of law and order and kind of striking out at everybody that they are accusing of being traitors, or traitors, whether they're Tutsis who were secretly working for the Rwandan Patriotic Front or Hutus who are secretly working for the Rwandan Patriotic Front. But after the assassination and the kind of decapitation of the government and the defeat of the Rwandan military and the loss of all foreign supply and aid, and then the Americans backing the RPF and the UN backing the RPF, Kagame ends up in power. So that's a situation at the end of 1994. And then I'll gloss over a little bit. I'll over summarize what happens, because the refugees in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo and the refugees inside Rwanda are then attacked and massacred by Kagame's forces, and Rwanda basically occupies these Kivus, and they've continuously occupied the Kivus since the 1990s. And so this civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo now, that people are talking about as like a genocide in the Congo now, that's still Rwandan forces, Rwandan proxy forces. The current name is M23, but they've been Rwandan forces in the Eastern Congo, effectively occupying the Congo since 1996. Okay, so what does this tell us? Does this teach us anything about the genocide in Gaza? Well, yeah, yes and no. So one thing to notice is in terms of the way that it's talked about, it's like you'll hear people say, the Palestinians are victims of the genocide, the way that, the Tutsis are like Kagame. Kagame is the one who speaks for the Rwandan genocide, right? But Kagame is as pro-Israel as it gets. Kagame is taking African people that Israel wants to deport. Rwanda's taking African people that England wants to deport, right? So the Kagame and Israel, Kagame and Netanyahu are very good friends. And that actually makes a lot of sense, because Kagame and Rwanda is occupying the Eastern DRC, and the way that Kagame prosecuted the war in 1994 was with utter disregard for the so-called interior Tutsi. They were from Uganda. They were taking over Rwanda as a fresh, American conquest, American-backed conquest, and then they went on to do it again in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. So they were not, the way that they used the kind of idea of genocide was the way that Kagame uses it is very instrumental, and it's very it's all to fulfill an agenda of Kagame's own massacres, and of which there have been many, including very notable ones like Kibeho and Bayumba, and many huge massacres inside the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so how much of that can we say And I think I mentioned Judy Reaver's book to you before. Judy Reaver's book, In Praise of Blood, The Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. Highly recommended. I used it in my own research on the topic in my book. So the way that they deploy kind of narrative warfare, the Kagame's people, is actually very similar to the way the pro-Israel people behave. The way that they try to take the genocide out of all context, out of the context of war, out of the context of what Kagame did in Uganda, and then the invasion, the assassination of President Habyarimana in 1994. All of those things, like the idea that mentioning context is itself like problematic and wrong. That is all out of the pro-Israel playbook. And if you try to understand what's happening in Congo and Rwanda, you'll encounter a lot of the same tricks that are in the pro-Israel playbook, which is like the playbook of Western pro-war and imperial propaganda. But Rwanda does have a certain exceptional role in this, which is analogous to the role of Israel. And so that is maybe there's, I don't know if, I'm not sure how much more there is to draw, how much more parallel there is to draw. I mentioned before that like there were mass rapes. This is the place where mass rape by Kagame's forces and Kagame's proxies are used as a weapon. And there's many women who survive. There's infrastructure dedicated to rehabilitation and healing. And so it also, like, if you understand that history and you understand the way that rape is used as a weapon, the whole October 7th notion that Hamas did mass rapes as a weapon of war, it doesn't fit with what happened in the DRC with mass rape as a weapon of war, where there are thousands of women who survive, and very consistent stories and tremendous amounts of physical evidence, where it happens in the context of an occupation of a village in the middle of nowhere, where it's inaccessible, and not like lightning raids in urban areas, where the whole campaign is over in a matter of hours, in some cases minutes, which is what happened on October 7th. So this is another angle where knowing something about how a dynamic of conflict or war or violence works makes some of these claims that Israel is making very difficult to believe. I think that is it. I think that's what I wanted to say about the Rwandan genocide and the similarities, differences. I guess quantitatively, the death rate, the murder rate was higher. Each day there were more people who died in Rwanda than are being killed in Gaza by the Israelis. The Israeli war has already gone on longer than the Rwandan civil war. It was over. It started in April and it was over by basically July. There was a higher death rate, a shorter war. There was massacres by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, not as much as by the kind of disorganized militias. there was, in terms of international justice and the uselessness of the International Criminal Court, that was definitely the case here. I cover this in my book too. There's an amazing the incredible hypocrisy, like the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda was the predecessor of um, the International Criminal Court, and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda had evidence that the Rwandan Patriotic Front killed tens of thousands of people. They had solid evidence that they killed tens of thousands of people. They had solid evidence that it was Kagame who shot down the president's plane and assassinated Habyarimana, the Rwandan president, and started the whole war. And the things that they did to make sure that there was no justice for that were incredible. The prosecutor said, "I'm sorry, but my mandate starts after the assassination of the president, and therefore does not cover the assassination of the president." They literally buried, locked away like evidence in a locker, and made sure it didn't see the light of day. They sent special investigators. The Americans sent investigators to go and make reports on massacres in the Rwandan Patriotic Front controlled areas, and then they suppressed those reports and said they didn't even exist. So all of those, and then if you read like the Canadian commander's memoir, you've probably heard of it, He Shook Hands with the Devil. The way that he writes about Kagame is like it's like a love story. He talks about the way he looks and how he looks like an eagle and how he's like a giant bird lifting himself out of his chair. It's absolutely bizarre. It's bizarre how he talks about it. And so there is just a lot of racism, a lot of racist tropes, and a lot of what you would call like Africanist tropes, following like the idea of Orientalism in the Arab world, and all of that is also very similar. There's like a complete dehumanization, especially of the Hutus, of the Rwandan Hutus, who are basically like defined as totally subhuman. Like the idea is that they heard radio broadcasts and then they went and massacred their neighbors. So again, removal of context and the complete and utter demonization of the targeted population, who's and then like stories about them that are not at all believable. And then there's also things like the use of negotiations as a tool of the war, which we're seeing now in the context of Gaza. So yeah, plenty of similarities, but not it's not you don't want to take like a naive view on like mapping Rwanda onto Gaza, especially since the spokesperson for the Rwanda genocide is very much a Zionist dictator in Paul Kagame. All right, I'll stop there. I'll be back with more sit reps. Please do like and subscribe. John and I will be back, in the coming days. In terms of the next deep dives in historical contexts, I'm planning to read Ilan Pape's book very carefully, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. I've been watching interviews with Ilan Pape about it, and I think that's going to be very important in understanding just the Israeli mentality, like what they've done in the past and the way they've succeeded. If you watched my video on the 1967 war, that you see what an effect that had on the Israeli mentality. Well, 1948 would have an even bigger one in many ways. So we'll do 1948. We'll do Jordan. We talked about Syria, Egypt, the Palestinian Authority. So Jordan deserves some special mention, especially in this era of airdrops from Jordan. So yeah, those are a couple of the ones I want to talk about. I want to talk about nonviolence and the 2018 nonviolent march and other attempts at nonviolence in Palestinian history. And so yeah, at least three more of those historical ones coming up alongside the usual SITREP material. So we'll see you in the next one. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you soon.